Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. Wednesday is United Nations Human Rights Day. Many observers describe 2014 as a horrific year for human rights violations. War is the major source of abuses around the world. And in the past 12 months, major conflicts have intensified. We begin our coverage with Henry Ridgwell from London.
Syria's civil war has killed hundreds of thousands and forced millions from their homes. The conflict has splintered and spread to neighbouring Iraq, with government forces, moderate opposition fighters, Islamist militants and Kurdish fighters all battling for territory. The international community must take some responsibility, says Steve Crawshaw, senior advisor at Amnesty International.
The failures to address the Syrian conflict better and earlier, and to really speak out loudly and put the kind of pressures that were needed for human rights to be better observed.
Barrels packed with explosives dropped from helicopters have been used widely by Syrian government forces, killing thousands of civilians. Syria's key ally, Russia, should speak out against their use, says Director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth.
They allow ISIS to say that at least it is standing up to the Russian-backed government in Damascus that is trying to commit mass murder among civilians in opposition-held areas.
Moscow is fueling conflict in eastern Ukraine by providing military support to separatists. Close to 4,500 people have been killed, and there are numerous cases of abduction and torture. On a recent visit to Moscow, Roth said the situation could deteriorate further.
I think it is political insecurity that lies behind all of this, and I fear that this is only going to intensify as Russia now encounters some real economic problems as a consequence of Putin's adventurism in Ukraine.
Moscow's increasing isolation has led to the worst crackdown on dissent within Russia since Soviet times, according to Roth.
All this adds up to is that the architecture is in place for a still more intense crackdown should Putin need it.
China is accused of rolling back recent progress on human rights with its ongoing crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. Again, Steve Crawshaw of Amnesty.
Those basic rights of freedom of expression and assembly are simply being denied.
The spread of Islamist militant groups in Africa is driving human rights violations on a vast scale. Killings and suicide attacks by Boko Haram in Nigeria are intensifying, while Nigerian government forces are accused of beheadings and torture. In Egypt, rights activists say the hopes of the Arab Spring protesters are all but extinguished. But Amnesty International is highlighting two key achievements elsewhere in the past 12 months.
In Sri Lanka, there is now an international inquiry into the terrible killings of 2009, where tens of thousands of civilians died. Also, in UN terms, there's the Arms Trade Treaty, which we've been campaigning for 20 years.
Overall, though, Human Rights Day 2014 will likely be seen as a reminder of the vast scale of abuses in many parts of the world. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
Well, for more insight on the state of global human rights, we are joined by Adotey Akwei, Managing Director, Government Relations, Amnesty International USA. Mr. Akwei, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much.
Now, looking at that report, and you've been in this business for quite a long time, how would you describe the year we are in, 2013 also, and looking back 2012? Are things just gotten that bad?
It is arguably been a very, very bad year in terms of human rights. The newsreel that you just showed highlighted the issues in Egypt, in the Ukraine, the crackdown in Hong Kong. It showed the unrest in Nigeria. And there was also, of course, the issue of Ebola, which is not a human rights violation, but the response to it, both in terms of resources and in terms of treatment of people from West Africa, and the rearing up of potential racist types of stereotyping is disturbing. So it's been a very hard year. We mentioned South Sudan, the conflict there that has killed so many people and displaced all of that hope with the optimism of South Sudan becoming independent. And then, of course, you have perennial challenges such as in the Great Lakes region as well as in Sudan itself.
Yeah. Now, other than just looking at these situations and giving some analysis, is there anything really that can be done to stop this, to reduce the violations of human rights?
Well, I think mention was made of the ratification as well as the coming into force of the Arms Trade Treaty. It's not going to solve everything, but it is going to potentially put brakes on arms supplies going to questionable forces and going to governments that have poor human rights records. It's going to act as some kind of brake and some kind of accountability. But promoting human rights and protecting human rights is slow and tedious work, and it demands persistence, and I think that's the key.
There's mention in the report of some gains, and then those gains kind of get lost along the way. Does it appear that perhaps sometimes when there are certain interests, actors, whether they're state actors or others, don't really care about whatever existing human rights protocols that exist?
Well, there's clearly the desire to do whatever they want. And so the question is, how do you encourage restraint and respect for human rights standards? And the only way to do that is, of course, transparency and accountability, which is why the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is so important, and why vigilance by both African governments or governments in general, as well as civil society, is critical. And that's a trend that has also, unfortunately, been alarming. But we need to protect that.
What do you do in situations where, for example, governments are fighting some vicious groups, like the case of Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab in the case of Kenya and even Somalia?
Yeah. There, I think we must not allow these governments to make the argument that the alternative, in other words, these forces are so bad that any means is justifiable. Because in the end, that reduces the legitimate government to being no better than the insurgent force. And that also results in the human rights violations being committed not only by the insurgents, but also by the government, and we move backwards.
Yeah, very quickly, over the years, have things been getting just worse year by year?
No, I think that there's a growing awareness, and that in itself leads to a larger human rights movement of people who are not going to allow this to happen. And so you have to take the setbacks also with the hope that this movement becomes active and engaged and does not take the status quo as unchangeable.
Okay, Adotey, thank you very much for joining us today. Well, Adotey Akwei is Managing Director, Government Relations at Amnesty International in the United States here. Now, we continue our Human Rights Day coverage with a closer look at the Syrian refugee crisis. Millions of Syrians have fled over the borders, but only a fraction have been given asylum in countries outside the region. Again, here's Henry Ridgwell.
Around 4 million Syrians, almost a fifth of the population, have fled the spiralling civil war in the past 3 years. The majority are living in poverty in Syria's neighbouring countries, says Sharif El-Sayed Ali of Amnesty International.
95% of them, 3.8 million, are in just 5 countries. That's Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq and Egypt.
About 150,000 Syrian refugees have made it to the European Union. Many have arrived on dilapidated boats across the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands have drowned on the journey. Europe is bearing only a fraction of the burden of Syria's neighbours, says Sharif.
Almost the same number of people who arrived in Turkey in the space of 10 days in September. And it's a tenth, Turkey is hosting more than 1.5 million people, so that's 10 times this number in just one country.
Less than 2% of Syrian refugees have been offered sanctuary by the rest of the world. The United States has offered what it calls an open-ended number of resettlement places for Syrian refugees.
The US has a very long process of checking people before they're resettled, and so far that has been an issue, in that people haven't been able to make it there. If you look elsewhere, Russia, Japan, China, zero, nothing. Not a single person that have offered to take. The same goes for the Gulf countries.
At a recent conference in Germany, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, urged international action.
This is not only a responsibility of the countries of the region, this is a responsibility of the whole of the international community.
Many Western countries, including Britain and the United States, are giving hundreds of millions of dollars. But last month, the United Nations was forced to suspend food aid to 1.7 million Syrian refugees, blaming pledges that were not honoured. Nazhar fled Homs in Syria and now lives in Lebanon.
I have 2 disabled children. The UN used to help. It's a catastrophe.
The UN has identified 380,000 people it says are in desperate need of resettlement, many of them victims of torture or rape, many of them children. Human rights groups want delegates at Tuesday's conference to commit to resettling at least 5% of Syria's refugees by the end of 2015. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.